That's right. I have wrestled with an alligator. I done tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning, throw thunder in jail.
You can't stop me.
I'm going to win.
It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
I won't quit.
I'll just keep getting stronger.
Stronger?
Stronger.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to, we don't even have episodes again, running joke. But this would be episode number 3 of Jeb and I, but I have no idea what on the Greater podcast, what episode it is. But this is kind of a continuation of a lot of the research podcasts we want to get put together. And the first 2 were just Jeb and I talking about our presentations we did in Costa Rica at Ben House's it's either Bro Research or BroCon, whatever he decided to call
BroCon.
But the first 2 were that. And then the cool thing is the third topic that we're going to talk about is metabolic flexibility, which we have Mike T. Nelson here. And he was actually at Costa Rica with us. So he saw our presentations and he helped me put together a lot of my slides at the very end when I was changing everything. So anyways, welcome Mike. And we'll try to do our best at continuing this conversation of research. But yeah, should we intro you? You know, just give a brief intro of all your stuff without going over like everything.
Yeah, basically I spent a crap ton in college. I like to pick up odd objects, go fly kites for fun off a surfboard, and talk about metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, and that, would you say that?
I listen to death metal too, so I got my Heaven Shall Burn shirt on today.
Where did the metabolic flexibility thing come in? I think you've talked about it before, but like, how did you become the MetFlex guy? Did you like have did you have an idea in your head, I'm going to be the MetFlex guy, or did it just happen?
No, I did a 5-year stint in the PhD program in Biomedical Engineering at the University of Minnesota. And I just really got tired of doing more math, even though I had a friggin' minor in mathematics at that point. So I did a master's in mechanical engineering. And I was sitting in an MRI class and the professor's like drawing stuff out. He's like, all right, we're going to derive all the equations used in an MRI now. Because I had to take one electrical engineering elective. And I'm looking at the guys next to me that it's all PhDs in math and physics. And I think there was only like one electrical engineer in the whole room. And so he just starts writing what looked like just gibberish on the board. And everyone's just frantically writing everything down. So I poked the guy next to me, was like a PhD in math or physics or something. I'm like, do you even know what he's writing on the board? He's like, no. And he's just frantically scribbling stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is such a disaster. Like, if I survive this class, I'm definitely not changing. But instead, I opted out. I just dropped 5 years of PhD work and went over to exercise physiology. That fall, like literally the first meeting I have with my advisor there, he walks in and he goes, hey, we got 2 new projects. They both involve math. One's on heart rate variability and one's on metabolic flexibility. And he looks around the table and he points at me and goes, hey, you math boy, like whatever your name is. Like, he doesn't even remember my name. He's like, these are your projects now. I'm like, you gotta be shitting me. Like, I came over here to avoid math, and like now I get projects that involve math. So that was 13 years ago now, I think. So yeah, that's basically how I got started in it.
Well, and the big thing too, so I don't know how you want to go about this, Jeb, but I'm kind of interested in like, so you get like a topic like MetFlex, because we're trying to like appeal to like coaches who are kind of like us, who look up to people like you, and then you kind of become experts in these topics and you can kind of talk about it without even preparing, which we did for this one. But what does that look like? So you're talking like 13 years ago and you got this MetFlex topic. How do you begin the process at that stage to kind of understand what the hell's going on and kind of maybe walk us through not the whole process of the 13 years, but kind of where your head was at and how did it change over time?
Yeah.
Is that helpful, Jeb?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I love that angle.
Yeah. So at first, I didn't get it. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? So my advisor farmed me out to another guy who worked underneath him, which was good because I didn't get along well with my advisor, to say the least. And I remember asking him, I'm like, wait a minute, I've like read a fair amount of nutrition, a fair amount of exercise phys. I've never heard of this topic. And he's like, well, it's how your body uses carbohydrates and how it uses fats. And I'm like, Isn't that what it's supposed to do? And he's like, but no, it's how you actually switch and move back and forth between those two fuels. I'm like, oh, so it's the switching part that's kind of new. And then what's fascinating to me is, so you go and look in the literature, right? So what's the first time the term metabolic flexibility was actually coined? It's from David Kelly's stuff right around year 2000. But previous to that, right, you can go back and look at Brooks and Mercier, which is 1992, the crossover effect, right? So as you increase exercise intensity, you use more carbohydrates. And you can go back even further than that. You can back up all the way to the early 1900s, the A.V. Hill and all the stuff they did too. So it's interesting to me how the idea has been around like forever, really. But until you put a term on it, no one thinks of it as a research topic per se, right? So once it has a term, now you're like, hey, I'm working into this area, even though it's kind of basic exercise physiology type stuff. And once I kind of wrapped my head around that, I was like, oh. And even now explaining it to other fitness professionals, it's kind of weird because everyone in fitness wants to argue about what is like the singular best fuel. Oh, it's carbohydrates. Oh, no, it's fat. And I'm like, that's such a stupid argument because you ideally want to use both. So I just started reading the research, and what I do initially is find like probably a pretty good review on it. Like who is probably the person who coined the term, like read everything that they ever did, because that gives you an insight into their thought process of what they're looking at and how they kind of came up with the idea. And then once I feel like I have a pretty good handle around that, then I go backwards in time. So I keep going earlier and earlier and earlier as far back as I can to get more of an idea of what assumptions do they make, what testing was done, what is kind of the projection and the iterations and the changes over time. And obviously that'll lead you into a whole bunch of different offshoots then too.
It's kind of funny because that's kind of what I do with the I can't even remember my topic. The high flux energy thing was which I found difficult because, like you said, it wasn't coined till I think like 2016.
Right.
And I had to go back to find all these things. I'm like, they're talking about this in whatever 2006, and then in whatever 1990.
But they use different terms, and that's the hard part about tracing stuff backwards from a coined term, right? Because it's the same idea, but you can't search that term anymore.
Right. So you have to be creative. So that's where that was probably the hardest part about like learning about a certain topic, is because a lot of these things change in their terminology over time. But then if you miss the other stuff, you kind of miss the starting point for a lot of it, and you have to start at a different point. So it's interesting because like even I found like that Amish study, which is something James Krieger, we've had him on before, but he's talked about energy flux and stuff, and he didn't even have that one. And it's just because like, why would you connect that with this? And you almost like accidentally, do you ever find yourself accidentally stumbling onto stuff that's helpful for your arguments?
Oh yeah. I mean, I still try to reserve what I call just random PubMed rabbit holing time. And I'll take and pull just all sorts of weird studies. I put them in an Evernote folder to read. Then I have them categorized within Evernote. But I usually have to put a hard limit on it. So that's kind of like random, figure out what's going on in the world time. And then if I have to do a very specific search, I actually have an assistant in India that will pull all my PubMed references and grab the full text, because I won't allow myself to go into PubMed because it'll be 2 hours later and I'll have like 35 papers that have absolutely nothing to do about the topic. So I purposely then try to limit myself into one area with pre-selected stuff. So I try to separate those two tasks.
It's interesting you say that because Jeb did that.
Oh, really?
I'd be messaging him and being like, he's like, how are you doing on anything? I was like, I don't know. I'm actually 35 papers deeper into something. I'm not even sure it has to do with this topic, but it's just, I keep getting in. I'm like, and I think a really interesting point, I want to circle back a minute, because an interesting point you brought up about research that I think is oft overlooked is that you said you go back and you read everything by the author of the study to see how they kind of are processing information, looking at information.
Yeah.
And, that's something that you don't hear a lot from people, because I guess it's just assumed amongst people who have PhDs or have done a lot of research. But that's a really, really valid point that I think a lot of those of us who are amateur at this, we miss, because we're just taking it, as like, okay, this is the person writing this, but how do they think? How do they process information? How are they arriving at these results, outside of just the numbers, the methodology?
Because it would have been a progression over time. Because usually, again, maybe you can correct me, but like with a lot of these people, I guess they would start off on something, and then their next study would be like an iteration or an evolution of their next thing over time. Is that kind of how that stuff works out?
Usually, I would say in a perfect world, yes. And then when I see a topic change, so the other thing I'll do is I'll look at what topics have they been looking at, right? So a trick for people listening is, in general, the last author on most things, especially in exercise phys, nutrition, the last author, that's normally the lab that they came from. So if you see someone as the last author, it's usually their grad student is probably the primary author, and then other people in the lab are probably in between. And again, you've got, stuff, collaborations going on with different groups or whatever. So if I'm scanning real quick and I see, for example, like Stu Phillips, if I'm looking at protein research, if he's a primary author, a lot of times his stuff now is mostly a review paper, things of that nature. If he's last, it's usually a new grad student that's probably the primary author. And so I'll scan through and look to see where he's kind of at in the list of authors. And then if he's last on all of them, I'll then look and grab all those, and I'll look at the trajectory of what they're actually studying, because that gives me a good handle on that lab, what information is coming out of that lab. And if you want to take the next step further, then you can then trace previous grad students and where they end up, right? So I'll look at stuff from like Nick Bird, who was, doing work over in the Netherlands, did his postdoc there, and I think now he's somewhere else that I forget. But you can kind of do this family tree of tracing people of where they went, right? So Luke Van Loon's lab is the other lab that does a lot of radioactive tracers for muscle protein synthetic work. And so if you're new to a topic, but you don't know any of that, you can kind of trace it by going, okay, this guy's lab, great. Oh, he's last author here. I'll go backwards in time up to 2020. And then I'll grab the grad student and I'll see what other papers they're working on. And then as I go backwards with that, right, because a lot of people will just stay in academics. So 7 years ago, this was a primary author. I'll grab his name. Oh, what else are they doing now? Oh, they ended up in this lab over here doing a continuation of that work, but a little bit different. So it gives you a way of kind of tracing topics through. And then if I see a huge change in what the lab was actually looking at, if I get really motivated, I'll try to figure out what their funding source was and if that changed. Because a lot of times funding source will dictate kind of what areas they're looking at. And then, for example, if I know they're getting lots of funding from X and I see 7 out of 10 topics are associated to that, but then I see one that's not really associated to that. And I read it and I go, oh, you could run this study with just using grad students and a metabolic cart. Like, I don't need a lot of external fancy equipment. That may be what the researcher is really interested in, right? All this other stuff allows them to kind of, like for Stu Phillips stuff, right? So a lot of his stuff is looking at atrophy in people as they get older, sarcopenia, that type of research, because that's where he gets a lot of money from. You get an NIH grant to pay for that. But he does a lot of performance-based research too, because he has the lab equipment, he has the setup. You get some money for that, but last I heard, probably not as much. But when you talk to him, he's very interested in that area. So you're always kind of looking at this balance of what do they do to keep the lab running, keep the lights on, keep money coming in, and what is it that they're, really trying to look at within the confines of that too.
They're using atrophy money to pay for hypertrophy money.
Kind of, in a way. I mean, the lab I was in, I did more performance research. My advisor hated performance research. He thought it was the dumbest thing on the face of the planet. And I'm like, wait a minute, hold on, you're a PhD in exercise phys. Like, I asked him one day, I said, well, what do you think of exercise? He goes, I think it's okay. I'm like, okay. I'm like, why are you studying exercise? He's like, oh, I just use exercise to poke stuff around in the body to see what happens. So he's viewing exercise as a stressor to apply to a system just to see what happens. Like, he didn't give two shits about performance at all. where I'm like, that's interesting, but what happens from an adaptation standpoint, which is actually more a performance kind of line of thinking. So we had access to metabolic carts, we had access to treadmills, we had access to bikes. All that stuff was kind of paid for by the lab. So I was literally at Cub Foods buying Monster energy drink and other stuff out of my own pocket just to do what I thought was a more interesting question, because the metabolic cart and the gas and everything else was already paid for, which allowed me to then do some of that research.
That's crazy. I
Weird workaround.
Well, it's good that I actually like where we're going with this, because it's nice to pick your brain. I think for anyone trying to get into this, have you ever done like, I don't want to say a mind map, but like kind of isolating labs and knowing kind of what stuff comes out of there, and then
Oh yeah.
How do you categorize? Have you categorized that stuff? Because I know you have a crazy Evernote.
Oh yeah, and after a while, it's literally, they call it like the academic family tree, right? And a lot of it you can trace back to some of the original stuff, right? So if you're, super interested in caffeine work, right? You can look to see, in Canada where Terry Graham did some of his stuff work, right? And then you'll go back further and you look at, okay, who is all the early authors that did a lot of caffeine research? Oh, Costello is one of the main dudes, right? And you can almost trace people that came out of, his lab and what they're doing for offshoots of that too. So, and then a lot of it's equipment limited, right? So you're looking at like protein synthetic research. There's 6 labs, I think, in the entire world that probably even do that type of studies. I mean, so there's just not that many when you get into stuff that's expensive and also a lot more technical too.
That's crazy. Now I'm like thinking like it kind of makes a lot more sense if that, like it's kind of like why certain people go on certain topics, but like we're just lucky enough that the people that are researching some of these topics happen to be in a lab where they can research some of it. Because if they were in a different lab, the research might not come out. So it's
a self-perpetuating thing too, right? So like if I was going to do protein synthetic research, there's probably only like literally a handful of universities I could go to do that in-depth of work, right? Because that's kind of their main deal of what they do. If I wanted to do that at the University of Minnesota, for example, which, a major D1 school, 60-some thousand people, there's nobody there that does that currently, right? So it's just not an option, right? I'd have to go somewhere else if I wanted to do that.
Very cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of. Do you have any? What were you thinking on that, Jeb?
I mean, my thought process is always like, okay, no, where do we go with this, right? Because just blatant self-interest. But seriously, like now I'm like, okay, now I want to go back on the topics that I looked at and start to see like, okay, where are the connections here? Now can I go back into this lab and see if I can pull some more studies, and hopefully, even if they're not directly related to whatever topic I'm looking at, there might be some corollary stuff in there that could relate and maybe lead to a new topic.
That was the one thing, and maybe that you can be helpful on this, is like when I'm looking in this thing, it's like we're trying to derive mechanisms. So like part of the project we did was like you're supposed to have a question and research it and then kind of break things into what mechanisms are at play. And sometimes like your brain just gets like, I don't know what mechanisms are. I just was reading about Metflex or high flux energy. Like I don't know. But you could use, and maybe this is where we'll ask you what you do, but when I listen to Jeb and I'm like, oh, well, then you can see what the lab looks at, because they're looking at mechanisms probably like 5 years prior, and then they're connecting the dots later. But how do you go about, I guess, understanding or finding which mechanisms are on a given topic, especially coming from somewhere where you might not know some of those background things to even understand that it is a mechanism?
Yeah, the biggest thing I'll look at is what papers are they citing, right? So again, if I go back to, protein synthesis or some muscle hypertrophy thing, right? A lot of times in the discussion or the background, they'll cite previous mechanistic work, even if that lab doesn't do any of that stuff at all, right? Because they have to lay out what is the baseline argument we have for this. We've seen this in rats. We did this study. We make the mice squat. That was done by, XYZ lab. Because a lot of times labs will be differentiated on animal researcher versus human research. And that could be even different within universities. So for example, when I was at the University of Minnesota, up until recently, they didn't do any animal research at all, period, for exercise phys. Now, when they got a new dean, his background was all in animal research. So they literally stripped out one whole area and it became animal research, which has its own ethics arm, right? So I worked for a medical device company for a while. Human subjects have to go through what's called IRB, Institutional Review Board. For animal studies, there's actually the same thing. It's usually called IACUC, right? So animal ethics is same idea, different committee. So everything is kind of different. So if I'm looking at mechanistic stuff, it may cite, Mike Robertson's lab because they do a lot more mechanistic stuff. And in the future, what they're doing more of now, which is great, is they'll do a combined study and they'll send data maybe from, let's say, human muscle fiber. They may say, okay, we're going to do a chronic training study. We're going to give these bros protein and we're going to beat the crap out of them in the lab. So as a human performance lab, I'm going to look at the supervision of it, the outcome, the exercise performance, but maybe I can take samples out and maybe I can send them to Andy Gelpin's lab and he can do some muscle fiber analysis of it. Maybe he can do more of the mechanistic type work, or he may send them off to someone else's lab. Or they can do a partnership where they'll do parallel design studies. They'll do the same thing in humans and they'll do it also in mice. So maybe Mike Robertson's lab will do the mouse arm mechanistic portion of the study, and then someone else will do the human portion of it. And then they'll either write a joint paper or they'll cite each other's papers back and forth. But it's kind of going on in parallel instead of in series. When I was at the physiology department at the University of Minnesota, there was a guy there looking at blood pressure research. So he had a huge grant from NIH. And what they did, which was super unique and I wish was replicated more, is they said, okay, here's our question about blood pressure. Here's what we really, really want to know. But we know that each lab probably has an area that they're really good in that doesn't necessarily overlap. So they picked a lab that's really good in genetics. They picked a lab that's really good in animal research. They picked a lab that's really good in human research. And they had one other lab, I can't remember what they were looking at. But they had basically 5 labs, and the guy who was working with John Osborne, he was a coordinator of all of those. So he was a high-level systems guy that didn't necessarily know all the details of each one, but could look and go, okay, we want to see what the genetic component is. We want an animal study to see what mechanistic component there is. We want to see all of these things. How do we coordinate all these, 6 different experiments so that they lead us to an answer to this question we're trying to figure out? And we can run all of these at the same time. But we need someone in charge to coordinate that to make sure that we're all asking the right questions. When we try to take all this data and piece it into a bigger puzzle, it all kind of makes sense and it is all going in the right direction. So to me, that in terms of research, I wish more places would do that. But it's hard from a coordination standpoint. It's hard from a funding standpoint. It's hard actually to find people at a systems level who can look at that and know enough to ask, what genetics questions should I ask, but trust that the lab's going to do it in the best way that they can. So hopefully in the future, there's more of that kind of thing to solve more complicated questions.
That was the problem with my stuff, and I don't know how Jeb feels about it, but like when you're looking at the mechanisms, and like I'm coming at it from a spot of I have to present this in front of Mike and Eric. But like, am I making a logical jump from these mechanisms to this thing, especially when there's not much connection either between labs or between papers and
oh yeah, definitely
time. So it's like you're looking at something from early 2000s that you're trying to connect to something in the late 2015s. I don't know how you, but
close enough.
But yeah, like so, like I guess that was my hardest struggle. That was my biggest struggle throughout this process, was looking at mechanisms and hoping that they connect and trying to connect the dots, but it was super difficult. Like, I don't know what you thought about that, Jeb.
I mean, for me, obviously, more of the stuff that I'm interested in, more of the time I spent is softer sciences, is behavioral sciences. So I most of the mechanistic stuff is I kind of have to tend towards the hard science part of it. So, the behavioral stuff is I don't want to say it's more subjective, but But when we're talking about like, nutrition stuff, it's 24-hour recall, like all these things. So most of the studies are really on behavior. They're not on, does X cause Y? So like for me, like, I utilize some of the neuroscience stuff to start making mechanistic leaps, but it was, again, it's when you're looking at like, like you said, like protein synthesis or something, there's a lot more, I feel like, in that than in the behavioral stuff, where there's a lot more room for interpretation, I think, within the numbers, and even the statistics are derived from questionnaires and the like.
I guess maybe that's where I want to go with it. How do you understand if you're, I guess, making logical jumps, or like, how do you not, I guess, bulletproof, but you're going to have a theory based on this mechanism that's going to go to this. How do you feel okay about presenting that information in a way that kind of creates that jump for people? Does that make sense? Because
So a couple of things. So if I'm in a perfect world, if I'm teaching a topic, right? So like the presentation I did in Costa Rica on the model that I use for training and for testing and assessment. In a perfect world, I want to put the data points close enough that the people in the audience make the connection, right? Or Ben House would say, how do I get them to trip over the truth, right? It's the same idea, same concept to me. Now I'll keep moving them closer and closer and closer, because if you sitting in the audience make that connection, ooh, that's something you're probably going to remember. If I just told it to you, not a lot of work, right? You don't really have to connect those synapses together. You don't have to make that association. So I always play the game when I present as like, how close do I have to put the dots for people to get it, or at least one person to kind of make that connection. So same idea, looking at mechanistic to outcome stuff. In a perfect world, I would design studies with outcome first and then have someone else do mechanistic stuff. And I think the outcome matters more than the mechanism stuff. A lot of times we do the opposite. We do mechanistic research because that's pretty sexy. Maybe the lab gets funding for it. And I know I've done this extension of, here's this mechanism. I think this goes here. And a lot of times that's incredibly speculative and we have no idea, right? I would rather go the reverse of, hey, we gave them XYZ supplement and we saw this outcome. Cool. Do we know anything about the mechanism? No, that doesn't tell us dick about the mechanism at all. But it says in this group of subjects that it did work. We got this outcome, right? And then I think it's interesting, can you replicate that outcome, right? If we can, okay, it's probably a real thing. Now, can we look inside the black box and see what is a possible mechanism? I think that's more useful to people as trainers, because the trainer can take that info and say, oh, we got this result. How do we get it? I have no friggin' idea, but I know that this will probably make an increase in their speed and power by 5%. The mechanistic stuff is harder to go the other way. Right. So, for example, the other day I'm reading, there's a brand new study that came out on metabolic flexibility and related to a supplement. And so I started reading it and I'm like, oh, wow, CLA actually, a fat helped increase the metabolic flexibility. I'm like, I wouldn't have expected that. And I'm reading them like in rats. Like, oh, shit. Right. Not that rat research is bad, but if you know the CLA research related to rodents, like CLA is like freaking magical in rodents. It's amazing. They get super lean, super jacked. In humans, it does actually almost nothing. So for whatever reason, CLA is very specific to a species. And you'll keep seeing more research in that area because it's easy to do an extension of that research already. In my opinion, is it super useful? Not really. CLA has been around forever. It's easy to get past IRB. There's no reason you shouldn't be doing more human subject studies in it, unless you're trying to cure some pathology in rats or something like that. So I think the mechanistic stuff, we have to be careful, because if you didn't know that, it would be an easy extension to be like, oh, wow, look at this new supplement increases metabolic flexibility. But you kind of missed a lot of the other background research. And that's when you have the luxury of having the background research. If it's new, you don't know that. right? So when I try to present, I try to say, okay, here's what we know, here's what I think may happen, and here's a way you as an individual can test it to see if that's what's going to happen. Because most of the people in the audience, that's what they really want to know. Hey, bro, if I take creatine, am I going to get more jacked? Right? They could give two shits less that there's like 500 peer-reviewed, things on creatine. They may be interested in that, but they only really want to know is, did you actually know that? So the thing that you're telling me is more accurate, right? Especially clients, right? But I think it's useful for people like us who are in the education space of, doing the homework, going back and looking, okay, does this plausible mechanism, is there any studies that show that this actually happens? And a lot of times that research is missing or is not in the population that you want.
Well, that's
right? So
why.
my pet
Yeah.
peeve is the overextension of that. Like some people are like, oh yeah, this was amazing. You read the reference and it was like, oh, it was done in mice or done in, there's some crazy stuff on like collagen being, super anabolic. And you pull the studies and it's like in elderly men age 85 who barely move, and their protein was like ungodly low. It's like, okay, great. This is no longer that helpful.
Well, this is why. So one of the reasons why I think this is important, because I'm thinking like, how does Mike think about things? Because especially if you look at a lot of your new stuff, and I don't know how much you presented on it, but like you have Metflex, and then you have what you did it physiological flexibility and
Yep.
then psychological flexibility, but like a lot of those things I would say don't have, like that's a name you came up with. Like when we look at hot versus cold, there's no one talking about the flexibility between the systems. So I guess how do you formulate? It just sucks because that research isn't going to get done in a long time. So
Probably not.
How do you continue on with these theories, with this research, and start to formulate, I guess, your own stuff, knowing that the end point, you can't work backwards right now, and it's probably not going to be realistic for a while. Like, what's your thoughts on that for you? Because basically you presented a lot of the stuff that isn't going to be done for a while.
Yeah, and that's the hard part, right? So for me, what I find interesting is, can we take the current research and what is the extension of the current research, right? Because and I've gotten like huge debated arguments about this. Like a couple of years ago, I got in a big debate with we won't say his name, very well-known researcher in the area, and he's a super nice guy, done a lot of research, and we're talking about metabolic flexibility. So I said, hey, what do you think of this for fasted aerobic training? He's like, that's just not worth, it's utterly fucking worthless, don't bother. And I said, well, what do you think about the concept of metabolic flexibility? I don't know. I think there could be more research. Yeah, I agree. And basically at the end it was, I'm willing to speculate off of a couple studies and say that here's what it's based on, but here's where I think it's going. And he was like, no, we need a lot more studies. I'm like, well, how many studies do you need? It's like, no, I need to see the study. I need to see how it's run. And I'm like, yeah, totally get that. But his threshold of where in his brain a consensus would be was like, we need like 17 randomized peer-reviewed controlled trials. And that's fine, right? Because no one is ever going to agree on what is the amount of research they need to see before they're able to speculate, right? So one of the things I like asking researchers, okay, so you've been spending your last 3 decades studying this thing. What do you think is true that you haven't run an experiment yet on? Right? Because they're probably able to speculate a little bit better than Bob we pull off the street who doesn't have any background in it at all. Right? Now, it doesn't mean that they're right. They could easily be wrong. And what's fascinating is some researchers are very good at doing that. Other ones are really good at only doing what is the next experiment, right? So then if I say, okay, what do you think about like 5 years from now? What do you think you're going to be looking at? Like some people researchers can't even answer that because they've never even thought that far ahead. They've thought like, what is the next experiment I want to run? So I go all the way back up to, well, what are the principles that kind of govern physiology, right? If we just take this black box and we go, what are things that have just kind of been proven to be true over time? And if we understand those principles, if we apply those to the thing we're looking at, based on those principles, what do we think would be true next, right? So for example, if I'm looking at physiologic flexibility, I think a component of that is What do we know are like homeostatic regulators in the body, right? What are things that your body absolutely has to regulate no matter what? Now, how did I even get to that question? Well, I got there because I think that your body is designed for survival. If you want to perform better, you need to teach it to survive better. So if your body is hardwired, everything in your body is trying possible to survive, there's probably subcomponents of that that your body absolutely has to hold true. One of those is being temperature. So 98.6, you can only oscillate a few degrees above and below that. You get outside of that range and you're dead. So that's probably an important regulator within the body. The body's trying to do everything it can to survive. However, we know some people are really good at handling more cold. Some people are really good at handling more heat. So can we fluctuate those variables around and build up a better system related to heat regulation? Will that make you a more robust human? My guess is probably yes, because that is a homeostatic regulator in the body. Your body is trying to survive as best that it can. Now, going to a whole bunch of studies that have been done to look at this, kind of, right? They're all looking at all different aspects of that. And you do find some stuff related to cold water exposure, related to like glucose and other things like that. But you'll probably never have a series of studies that looks at that to the depth that I would like to see. However, people can still do those actions, right? So now I'm looking at, okay, what is the asymmetric, ideally it's going to be an asymmetric risk, meaning that the potential upside is kind of unbounded or possibly just completely unknown. But what do we know about the downside, right? So I get really nervous recommending stuff that I don't know anything about the downside because that could be very dangerous. We have very good data on what are the limits for heat and what are the limits for cold. Like those have been pretty damn well defined, especially by the military and other groups. So we have a really good idea what that downside is. So therefore I feel more comfortable saying, okay, these things are probably better for you. Here's the reason why. Don't have a ton of data on that, but we have really good data on what the downside is. So if you're going to run these experiments on your own, here's what not to do, right? You know, don't press this button, don't do this, don't stick your finger in the outlet, right? Like the things are what not to do, because to me that's more important. And at worst, you're going to be safe, right? No harm is going to come to you as long as you're not an idiot. Now, do we know exactly how much of a benefit you're going to see from doing those things? No, we don't have any idea, really. We know that there's some benefit in certain cases. But to me, I'll take that bet like any day, right? Because once I've got all the other basics covered, here's where I think the next area is to go. Okay, we know here's what the downside's pretty well known. I'll kind of hedge my bets and go, I'll kind of play around with this and see what is kind of the upside with it.
I like that for
I think,
formulating.
I was going to say,
It's like what we talked about.
it's really cool as like a insight into Mike as a person, because I think you definitely like I feel like, especially in like the evidence-based world and the you know, the PhD kind of realm, are definitely someone who takes more quote unquote risks, like say like, oh, I think this is a cool thing. There's not like a whole ton of evidence to it, but like, here's what I've seen. Whereas there's a lot of other people in the sphere who would not touch it just because they'd be afraid of there not being enough evidence and them being like labeled.
I don't even know
and you're super brave about that.
I don't even know if they're afraid. Like that's probably why I like you so much. It's like, we'll just raise my, but I hate when there's like, I say arguments, but when there's like discussions around this stuff and it's like, no, there's no research, like game over, like we cannot say that. And it's just, I don't want to live in that world because I'm a bro. And like, there's a lot of things that like I found over time that haven't really been researched. High flux was one, like until it was, but it was like, I just find, I don't like the box around that type of thinking. You know,
and even the answer of, I get lots of hate mail from the evidence-based community. I'll leave it at that. The two things that bother me the most are when someone is saying something based on research and you know that there absolutely is no research at all, right? It's like, okay, you can't say, oh, XYZ is based on, no, there's no freaking research on that at all. So get rid of that. But then you also have the other side of, oh man, I can only talk about what the research says. And I'm like, but you're not misquoting research. You're not trying to make up research that's not there to support your point, which happens all the time and drives me batshit crazy. However, the answer of there is no research to support that may be correct. But if you say there just is no research on that topic at all, there's just a dearth, that literally means we have no friggin' idea, right? We haven't even run any of the experiments. So the answer is we don't know. The answer is not, it can't work, right? Because, you know, you guys have done RPR. I've done all sorts of weird, crazy shit that I'm like, if I'm looking at this and I'm a rational human, I'm like, and I told Cal this initially too. I'm like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't think that this is going to work, but you seem to believe in it. So what the hell? I'll try it. And I'm like, wow, that really seems to work. Can I point to any research that says, here's why that works? No. Can I point to any research that says even affirmatively that it works? No. Why? Because it hasn't been done yet. So the answer is we don't really know. We can't say that it's a negative. We can't really say it's a positive. The answer is we don't know. But in the meantime, I'm going to play around with this and see what happens.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I like digging into your thoughts on it, because it's like if and people listening, if they want to like get into this world, it's like I find that there's like people, and I think Jeb and I felt like this. We didn't want to write about something unless it was like all researched, and I just don't like that confined, because like you said, there's a lot of these jumps we can make, but I like that asymmetrical risk, I guess. Outline for like maybe how you should approach if you are one of those people that want to talk about stuff that you're not for sure about, or you can't find the research, is one of those things where there's a lot of upside and like almost no downside. I just think that you can't get into that realm unless you look at both points, which means you have to be a little bit unbiased going into it, because a lot of times, like even when we were probably starting, our research is like, I even said it, like I'm completely biased. But the first presentation I did, Ben was like, maybe you should talk about the negatives. And I had looked into it. It's just, I didn't talk about it, which again, I think that's a good way to feel good about making these jumps, or making not even claims, but just talking about a subject. If you talk about both points, then you can kind of cover your ass.
And I think always trying to disprove your own theories, right? Because it's human nature, right? So I mean, obviously I've done metabolic flexibility. So if you're going to ask me, I'm like, yeah, I think it's useful, but I always like poking other researchers who don't know, or maybe don't even know me, and go up to them and be like, hey, yeah, you ever heard of metabolic flexibility? Yeah. Like, what do you think of it? And they're like, they'll give me like an honest answer, or here's what I think of this. Is this, do you think this is wrong? Right. So in my head, I know that I'm going to be biased to trying to collect information that agrees with what I'm doing. But then I try to actively set aside time to disprove what I'm actually doing, right? Even like with stuff like listening to podcasts. Like, yeah, I listen to most podcasts I like. I probably agree with most of their stuff. But I have a list of a few people that I'll listen to once a week where I honestly think a lot of them are batshit crazy and insane. But I'm going to force myself to listen to stuff that's a little bit out there that really makes me go, oh man, I don't know, because it's like I don't want to live in my own echo chamber all of the time either. And luckily, when you have clients and you interact with other people, like a lot of this stuff just kind of comes to you anyway. But I try to at least kind of actively seek it out a little bit so that I don't just end up falling into my own confirmation bias like continually.
Kelly, been hanging around.
I literally ended up here because at this point, because I kept falling into things that were like pointing that I was maybe, if not completely wrong about things, at least misguided. And like, that's the only reason I'm so interested in this stuff, is because I'm like, I was missing out on so much because I had my own biases in my head. Like, what am I missing out in? I just have a, hopefully a little bit more educated network now, but there's still that same echo chamber if I don't allow myself to get outside of it.
Oh yeah, totally.
I kind of do that too. I think you can tell I've been hanging around with you guys too much. But even like a specific example of this, and like it's nothing against Joel Seedman, but like Joel Seedman, did you see Joel Seedman's like 90-degree squat post?
Oh, God.
No.
Basically, he basically has a new ebook or whatever a new article series about like, you don't need to squat ass to grass. You just need to squat to like a 90-degree angle, which ends up being above parallel when you like look at the geometry of it. Anyways, long
So
story
like power lifter rules?
no, like even higher than that. Like literally to the point where like you start to hinge things, like you just stop and go.
Oh, upper body.
No,
Vertical?
I don't even. He basically just combined the knee angle, the shin angle,
Yeah.
the femur, and then like it just has to be at 9 degrees here and here. So for upper body, for anyone watching. So and that ends up being somewhere because parallel would be here,
Right.
but like there, if your shin angle's here, and then so it's like it's a quarter
It's
squat,
90 degrees.
Yeah, and it's. Anyways, long story short is like. He still has a PhD. So the biggest complaint is like, this guy got a PhD. He's such a fucking idiot. Obviously you squat ass to grass. And like, I don't even know if I disagree or agree, but I like reading his stuff and reading the comments on things because you get a lot of, I guess, ideologies in those posts. And like, maybe he's not wrong, but it's just like, he's being like, they're trying to get him out of the industry because he talked about a quarter squat. And it's like, is that really helpful to anyone?
Was he talking about it for sprint performance?
He's talking about it for everyone because
Okay.
Yeah.
So here, you know, in the same dose, like everyone's freaking out about it, right? Because
I don't agree with it, by the way, but it's just,
I don't agree, or I don't have enough information to agree or disagree, really. Like but I know that, like, anecdotally, like Mike Jenkins, who was, you know, one of the best strongmen alive while he was still living, he only did high quarter squats to a high box. Plenty, like you said, sprint coaches, plenty of speed coaches have talked about the benefits of quarter squats over full range of motion squats.
Well, that's why it's just, I think anyone listening, and like when you listen to how Mike formulates his stuff, I'm not saying Joel Seaman took the Mike T. Nelson approach, but he's kind of entering in those waters of stuff that people aren't talking about. There's not much research. Like he was saying that there was research, and then Lane. So this is how crazy it got. Lane Norton goes on there, calls him out. I want you to specifically do all this research. And Joel's like, read my article. All the research is there. He's like, you're going to quote your article and blah, 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 blah. But it's like, I want people listening to not be in that world and just look at things and like kind of come up to your own conclusions and like ask the questions, but don't assume everything's wrong. Like go actually look into
actual critical thinking skills.
Because like people would say that about your stuff, I'm sure. Like when you talk about the hot and cold stuff, like people think just if you talk about cold, you're crazy because you're talking about Wim Hof. And like, but at the same time, there's actually research in it, and like you've kind of done it in terms of you actually went to like a cold tub thing.
Yeah, I got one in my garage now. I got a freezer full of water.
That's been fun to watch that construction all take place on Instagram.
When I look at that though, I'm like, well, even if you initially think this is stupid, whatever, like you think these people are crazy, you at least go and like figure it out and like put your not money where your mouth is, but you have some skin in the game where you're like willing to test things out, which I think is helpful for people trying to develop stuff. Because I think a lot of people like us, like Jeb and I, trying to write content or do content or start to like kind of make a name for yourselves, is you don't want to step into that territory. But I think that that's probably the territory where we're best at because we're not PhDs and everything's almost been done before. So we're just gonna be a shittier version of people who are already experts at this stuff. So like, how do you kind of formulate new stuff?
And I always think like, what is new and interesting? A lot of it's just interesting to me, you know, because I'm more of a systems kind of person. I'm not real heavy into mechanisms. That's just not my forte. I mean, I can kind of fake some parts of it, but some parts of it I'm like, I don't know, you know. So to me, that's how the interfaces are always more interesting. And I always think just by doing stuff, you learn stuff you would have, I wouldn't say never thought of, but probably unlikely would have thought of beforehand. Mm-hmm. Right. So like lately I've been doing a lot more nasal breathing stuff with rowing, and been doing that off and on for probably like 2 years now. And I realized that like, oh, maybe we should redefine like mental training completely different than what we've done before. Right. It's not just how hard can you go and vomit in the corner and go again. Yeah, it takes a lot of effort, but it's like, can we put you in a very hard thing, and then can you not lose your shit? Right? Can we drop you in like 45 degrees of water and you not hyperventilate for like 3 minutes? You know, can you understand that it's a stressor, and then can you control it using breath work, whatever? Can you nasal breathe to a very high level heart rate, and can you stay there and focus there even though every part of your body wants to start breathing through your mouth, right? So what are things you can do to know that it's very clear whether you kind of did better or worse? And I think putting yourself in more stressful situations, but you can control it, I think is a key factor, because anyone can do, right? So squat, right? Anyone could probably do 1 rep of a Jeb 500-pound squat eccentrically, and then we mop them off the floor and take them to the hospital for all the shit that they've broken themselves, right? But can you go back down and come back up and, you know, kind of make it look pretty good? Cool, you can do that. You can handle the stress of that, and you're probably a more robust human for it. But I think there's too much of the putting people in very stressful situations that they're just not prepared for, and that's viewed as like mental toughness and training. But again, that's my only viewpoint now, just because of the stuff I've been doing, of something that you can do on an almost daily basis that's sort of sub-max, that is also very hard, where you have to kind of keep control of yourself. And how I got that was, you know, by doing kiteboarding stuff. Like, hey, can I, you know, go 20 feet off the water, be up in the air and just not lose my shit? Because if I do, I'm going to crash and it's going to hurt and I may get injured, right? So how do I kind of prepare myself a little bit for that? And a lot of it's just a eustress of doing a little bit more, a little bit more. Same thing with exercise, right? You know, the people who tend to make more progress are people whose training day in and day out looks pretty damn boring. Yeah, they just squatted again. They made it look pretty easy, right? You watch film of like Ed Cohn, you know, in training years ago, you're like, it's pretty boring to watch, other than he's got a lot of plates on the bar. You know, but I think that's probably more effective too.
So like this of course strikes a chord with me, because it's like jujitsu for me. It's like,
Yeah,
how can I be calm when I'm about to pass out? Like,
totally.
What can I do? And the crazy thing is it's the complete opposite of what your body tells you to do, right?
Oh God, yeah.
You know, it's like I sit there and I calm down and I start to I can flex a little bit of my neck here and gain a little space to like relieve pressure on my carotid, and then I can go over here and I can breathe, and it's not struggling. But yeah, I love that, because like you just put first of all, I think it's worth pointing out here too is why do you view these things the way you do? And I would argue, if we're making jumps here, that a lot of it is because you actually make your living working with real people.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right. So outcome is way more important to you than mechanism at all points, because if you don't get outcome, you don't get paid.
Yeah, I get no money and I'm living on the street.
Right.
Literally.
So I think that's and so we see that, like, you're willing to try something on yourself and then try it and then try, and maybe you don't have a lab, you can try it with, X clients, and they start to see changes, and you say, okay, well, that is observational research. It might not be the gold standard, but guess what? It's working for me.
When you can turn that into content, and I think that's kind of what I heard with Mike too. It's like you basically said go with what you're interested in, but also kind of where your expertise lies. And I think that, like, all too often I see it, just because we were kind of there, in the sense that, like, we have this career in personal training and then nutrition stuff. Like, that can't be discounted, but you can also be informed by some of these studies things. You're just not going to be a PhD. But there is a new thing that's going to come from that, because the observational stuff is a lot of outcome-based stuff. You just kind of have to work your way backwards. And I kind of want people to have a little bit of a blueprint that are kind of in our situation for putting stuff out there, because you didn't make it sound too difficult. Like, I'm sure there's a lot of work going in behind some of this stuff, but I think there's a lot of stuff that people can write about or do or talk about, and then have backing up evidence for that. They just have to work their way backwards from stuff they're interested in, and there is a way to do it without being an expert, quote unquote.
Yeah, and then I mean, the big sort of blinding flash of obvious I had just a couple of days ago, I was listening to an interview with David Epstein, who wrote the book Range, which is just really awesome, and loved it. And he was talking about how he started going back and reading, some of the early research for, learning, the 10,000 hour rule. And he was saying that the paper, the 10,000 hour rule, was originally based on, there was like no standard deviation on it. And he's like, anyone who would have read the actual paper would have realized that that's just plain weird, And so he then realized, after this kind of happened a couple other times, that other papers everyone had been quoting, So he's doing his due diligence. He's reading all the research. He's reading like 30 papers a day for some of his books. And what he realized was, after doing this for years, was that, oh my God, like, people don't really read research. There's a lot of people who say they read research, but he's like, the people who read all the papers, he's like, it's probably just a handful. So he was saying, if you want to be like the next level, journalism or what is you're doing, that if you have the ability to do that, and he was actually trained, his master's was as a scientist, that's probably a really good thing to do, because the perception is that people are doing it a lot, but they're probably not. Right. So I love a lot of the research reviews. I'm a big fan of Mass and what all those guys do. I think it's awesome. But I would love to know like a foolproof way of like, how many do they sell and how many people sit down and read it? And that's digested from the research itself. I have a feeling that it's really low. But a lot of people will say they have it, and a lot of people do have subscriptions, and we can see their numbers, and we do know there's a lot of subscriptions. But I just wonder, like, what is kind of the follow through on that? And I think it's a lot lower than what we think it is.
Well, and what I like to do, and another point to that is like, how many people read it and then they're like, well, I read the research, but no, you read the review. And like, so I like to use it. And I think I was telling you, Mike, this, like, the way to kind of test these skills is like, I would just pull the paper that it did and kind of come to my own conclusion based on my brain. It's not a science brain, but okay, did I come to some of these conclusions? Then I go read what Greg said or what Eric Helm said or what Trexler said. I'm like, okay, I'm not that far off. And then I'm finding the more and more I do that, the less far off I am. And so it's just a skill like anything else. It's a lot easier if you go pay to be a PhD.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in our position that aren't going back to school. Like, that's not possible. But I also think, Mass and like, I can't talk about the other one, but like Krieger's weightology. They're a good place to start for kind of seeing how these people think. And I think that that's what this is for us, is like putting out your brain in the world so that you can kind of take these things and then take the next jump. Because I think unless you take the next jump, it's going to be hard to be that next level publisher. And one person that comes to mind is Lou Schuler. He actually messaged me about my article and like, it said it was good and all this stuff. He's like, but long story short is he linked me some old articles that he wrote on high flux energy before it was a thing. He's like, oh, I loved it. But I started to have a new respect for Lou's writing, because, and then I told Jeb, I was like, Lou's been reading research for like 30 years.
Oh, and
he's on the level of a lot of these PhDs, and you wouldn't even know it because he's just writing and he's just editing. And so I think that anyone can get these skills. Not to say Lou shouldn't, but Lou did not want to get into fitness. Like, that's kind of, he's already said that. And so but he gained that skill just by kind of reading and getting better and writing and formulating ideas over time.
But he was one of the first, like, hardcore, like, he went to school for journalism and writing. And one of the first people that went back and actually got his CSCS. Right. So if you go back to David Epstein's point in range, like, he now has those two overlapping fields, and Lou's very, very good at it, but he's probably not an elite journalist. He's probably not an elite trainer. But if you think about journalists who want to talk about training, in my opinion, he's the dude, right? He's the man.
And that's a skill he developed over time without
definitely
PhD. And like, that's what, like, if anyone's listening, I think that's kind of where I kind of had a new respect for that. And it kind of formulated, I'm like, okay, I'm doing this right. And I hope that people get and listen to this, or like listen to these stories and start to piece together what that process looks like for them. For us, it was paying Ben to go to his course and do the research course and go and present. But I think that people can have that push without necessarily going to Costa Rica to present on whatever topic. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's part too. I like the thing about reading the original articles for Mass and then what those people wrote about it, but then also keep track of where do you disagree, right? And then I know they have a forum, like you could say, hey, I read this. Here's what I was thinking. This isn't what, Greg or Trexler or Eric or anybody said, because to me, that's the next level. That doesn't mean that you're right, because even everyone is going to be biased on their own background and their own interpretation. So yeah, if you have more formal training, odds are you're more quote unquote correct. But when I worked in the medical device company, we had two high-level PhDs, one in-house and one guy that we hired to figure out this huge problem that we're having. And I had to sit there every day for a month and a half and watch these two PhDs in statistics argue for a half hour about the exact same data. And that's when I kind of went, one, I'm never going to know shit about statistics at that level. And then two, oh my God, these people are like super high level PhDs in this. They're looking at the same data set and they don't agree, right? So stuff we think is incredibly black and white, it's when you get to that level, sometimes it's not as black and white as what we think that it is on the outside either.
Well, I think it's important as well for my growth and my knowledge base is to, if I do have disagreements or if I'm missing, to present that, and then to have someone who is more versed in these things to be like, no, and here's why you're wrong, because that teaches me way more than being right ever does.
Yeah.
That was
I mean, that's the times I've probably learned the most ever is that's a horrible idea and here's why. It's like, oh my God, I never even looked at that whole research. Like, how did that even exist? And I didn't even know that it existed, you know?
Well, and we talked about that is it's because a lot of these things, not that they're new, but they're not connected. Like, yes. And so that's where I found the biggest issue with finding answers was like, if you didn't search the right term in the PubMed thing, you're not going to get anything even close to your answer. And then even if you do have the right term, it might be termed something else from 10 years ago and you're going to miss it. So like, and that's where I think the best thing that you said was like, look at where they're pointing at the bottom of the articles, because you can kind of see their thought process too through some of the mechanisms. And then that's how I found a lot of my stuff, was not trying to do my own search terms, because I didn't even know what terms to search because I'm a moron. I stole them from other people that were smart.
Yeah. And that's where you do have an advantage of having, 4-year, 6-year PhD, whatever, having some academic background in the area, because you will be sort of force fed all of the basic and the background. And I mean, that's the only reason I knew about some of the energy flux studies, to be honest, is because as an undergrad taking exercise, 400 level, looking at the postal worker studies and, all this other stuff that, most people now have probably forgotten, because these are pretty old studies. But sometimes back then you could do very cool stuff that you couldn't do now. But as part of a basic curriculum, you're going to be exposed to a lot of that stuff, which at the time I'm like, I'm never going to use this worthless crap. And then, like 20 years later, like, oh yeah, that one study, well, how do I find that again?
Yeah. The postal worker one's such a great one, because that was, I remember bringing that up to Dean early on, being like, I can't remember where this is or who it's about, or I just know it was like postal workers in England, and
it was hard to find. So like, and before we close it up, because I know you got to go. I was trying to find the stupid study, knowing it's about postal workers and knowing it's about steps, and I still couldn't find it. I had to literally go Google postal worker study, and then it came up from some article talking about it, that linked to the PubMed thing, because my search terms were off, because they didn't actually have postal worker as a search term. I was like, well, this is stupid. Like, how, like, it doesn't even pop up. And then if you talk about flux, it doesn't pop up. I don't even know which terms I would use to search it if I didn't have a clue about the study.
Yeah. So when I get really stuck in PubMed, I'll actually take the same terms and put them into Google, knowing I'm probably not going to find the hardcore research on it, but I may find someone who wrote about the study. And then I look to see what terms did they use. And that'll give me an idea of the terms to put back into PubMed, or look at relevant articles on the right-hand side and see what terms are showing up in those articles. And sometimes that'll be enough to get me a little bit closer to what it was.
We know so that's what I did. But then remember so Mike, essentially I knew the research Mike was talking about that I should add into my presentation, but I didn't know where to find it. And then you were kind of giving me hints on how to find it, because I wanted to go through that process, because you would have you might not have told me, but even that was hard. I was looking at overfeeding for a specific question, and I type in overfeeding, and then all this other stuff comes through. It's just this is it's a lot harder than it looks. I think that you need to go through the process of understanding how stupid some of this stuff is, and how it's discombobulated. It's not a word, but it's so hard to connect dots. So I think it's good to kind of go through that process of trying to answer your own questions, because then you can kind of go through the struggle of, it's not so simple. And people are saying they look at the research, you kind of know what they're talking about when they do that, and you can kind of spot who doesn't.
Yeah, so I get really nervous about people who may not necessarily have a formal background and always tend to talk about the latest super hyper specific 1% difference, because they'll go from like here to here. They'll make this massive chasm of a jump, but in their brain, it's like this far. And that makes me like really nervous. It's like, I'm okay with taking some extensions and a big leap, but I get really nervous when you don't know that was a massive leap, right? Like, oh, I'm kind of twitchy now.
So we'll leave everyone at that. Don't be that guy, because like as much as we say fitness professionals aren't watching you, like some of them are, and they're talking shit about you if you're that guy on a podcast somewhere. Where's the best place to find you? I know we kind of linked it in our other podcast, and kind of what projects do you have up right now that people can kind of either pay for and support you or take to learn?
Yeah, so best general place is MikeTNelson.com. MikeTNelson.com. There'll be a little area at the top you can hop on in the newsletter. Most of my stuff goes, probably 80-90% goes through the newsletter now, which is free to hop on, which has been a lot of fun writing for that. And then other main project is the Flex Diet, looking at metabolic flexibility plus flexible dieting. And you can find that at flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. And as of now, it's not technically open, but there's a little contact us box there. Just send me a note. And because of all the craziness that's going on in the world, we ended up doing a payment plan. And if people still want to hop on there, I've just been letting people on whenever. So yeah, flexdiet.com is the other place there for the Flex Diet certification.
Sweet.
Even though we didn't end up talking about it at all, but having learned a lot about this from Mike over the years, definitely a super worthwhile topic to invest in. Just because it, like you said, it breaks down this dichotomous thinking of like you either have to burn carbs or have to burn fat, or that it really matters.
Yeah. And in the future, we're looking at possibly the next level certification, which would look more at like the physiologic flexibility of heat and cold and recovery mechanisms and pH and some other stuff. So once you're a pretty resilient human, you got all the basic stuff down from the Flex Diet of sleep and nutrition. What's kind of that next level you can do.
Sweet. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I always appreciate it. It's a good, fun time.
That's right. I have wrestled with an alligator. I done tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning, throw thunder in jail.
You can't stop me.
I'm going to win. It ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
I won't quit. I'll just keep getting stronger.
Stronger?
Stronger.